Good evening. I'm Kim Knox, President of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to share with you some of our upcoming events. February 14 is not only Valentine's Day, it marks the 103rd anniversary of the League of Women Voters of the United States. The organization has a long history of providing nonpartisan voter information and fighting for voter rights. On February 25, we'll be doing our state program planning meeting on Zoom. We'll get together to discuss which issues we believe the League of Women Voters of California should focus on next year, which starts in July. And that will be held again Saturday, February 25 at 10 a.m. on Zoom. And that's open to the public if anyone would like to join us and weigh in on what they think are the most important issues in the state. We'd love to hear from you. You can register for these and other events on our website, LWVSanDiego.org. I'll put that in the chat. And I want to let you know that the San Diego League is an all volunteer organization, and we greatly appreciate the donations that were made during registration for this event. For anyone who would like to make a donation today, I'll put a link in the chat for that as well. Now I would like to introduce the chair of our Criminal Justice Committee, Jeannie Brown.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I want to give a short explanation of why we chose this subject for tonight's event. In 2019, the members of the two local leagues in San Diego County voted to study policing practices in our county. There were 5 parts to the study, one of them being the effects of police in schools. After researching this topic, we came to a position that was then voted on by both leagues that said that we should shift funding away from supporting the use of school-based police and toward the use of school-based mental health and counseling personnel who use trauma-informed practices, transformative justice, and other supportive approaches. To reach these goals, we know that it will not be easy. We also know that some communities that have acted hastily and removed their school police officers abruptly had some negative consequences. We believe that our children's well-being is too important to act without a plan. It reminds me of the old adage, failing to plan is planning to fail. So it will be important to find common ground with our school communities and work together to achieve the best school environment for our children. We also believe that learning these skills while they are young can have lifetime benefits, not just in their education, but also in their families and careers. This is part of the League's work to inform our members and the community. I would like to begin with introducing Jennifer Vermillion, our first speaker. Jennifer is a project specialist with San Diego County Office of Education, training educators and assisting them in their multi-tiered system of supports, positive behavior intervention and support, and restorative practices initiative. She received her bachelor's in psychology and her master's degree in peace and justice studies. Prior to working with the county office, Jennifer spent 5 years with a nonprofit supporting schools in San Diego with their restorative justice practice implementation, training, and student leadership initiatives. Jennifer also provided direct services in addressing conflict issues between students, families, and school staff through a restorative justice model that restored individuals back into the community and kept youth out of the justice system. Jennifer has also worked as an adjunct professor for Point Loma Nazarene University in the Criminal Justice Department, teaching restorative practices as an alternative to the traditional justice system. Lastly, as a mother of 3, Jennifer regularly applies the philosophies and skills learned and practiced in restorative practices to build positive relationships with and between her own children. So you can see why we're very happy to have Jennifer with us tonight. Jennifer, it's all yours.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And it really is a pleasure to be here amidst so many wonderful practitioners and just folks really interested in what I think is some very important work. First, aside from my bio, I wanted to kind of give a little bit more of a history around my introduction to restorative practices, and also provide some information on what it is and what it is not. Because in my, I think, 8-9 years now of doing this work, one of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing is debunking some of the myths about restorative practices, restorative justice. But first, just like it said, I've been doing this work for now 8-9 years. I was first introduced to it through the University of San Diego in their Peace and Justice program, and first attended a workshop in restorative justice and learned all about the ways that some of our school districts here in San Diego, which is where I'm located, were trying to implement this very important work, and had the opportunity to go and work firsthand with students in training them up as leaders in building positive school climate, school communities within their own classrooms, as well as learning to facilitate conversations with youth who had committed a harm. So maybe a high-level misdemeanor or a low-level felony, and bringing them together with the person or people that they had harmed to have a conversation around what had happened, the impact of the harm, and then most importantly, what they can do to make it right. So I'll explain a little bit more about that. But first, I want to specify that while in our education system, restorative justice is a bit newer, it really is not a new concept. And really, if we look back over decades, we can see that it's looked 1,000 different ways in different communities, back from when people would gather around a fire, and it was at it was to the benefit of everyone in the community when a harm was caused, that they didn't kick out that person, because if that person played an integral role in that community, it didn't benefit anyone to kick them out of the community. And so a lot of the practices that we've seen over the years kind of really stems from that idea that as a community, we are stronger if we work towards restoring the people that have caused harm and making them accountable for repairing the harm that they caused. But some examples of where we've seen restorative work take place over the years is the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that followed the apartheid in South Africa. That was a form of restorative justice. The courts that were implemented as a way to bring accountability for what happened in the Rwandan genocide, that was a form of restorative justice. And there's plenty of places across the world where restorative justice is much more integrated into both their justice and educational system. So, for example, in New Zealand, they have only 5 juvenile facilities in all of New Zealand, whereas you contrast that with here in the US, and we've got 625 juvenile detention facilities in our country. But oddly enough, even in our own country, restorative justice has been more widely used within the justice system, even than within our educational system, which to me seems almost like it should be the reverse. But restorative justice, or sometimes you hear it referred to as restorative practices, is oftentimes misconstrued as being a slap on the wrist or a way to avoid accountability, or especially kids to avoid taking responsibility for their actions when they've done some harm. And in fact, it is very much the opposite. A lot of the work that I would do when there was a harm in a school, and I still do when there's a harm in a school, that entire process is about bringing or meeting first with the person who committed the harm and making sure that they understand the impact of their actions, and then meeting with the person that they harmed or people that they harmed and seeing what it is that they want to say. Oftentimes in education or our criminal justice system, the people that have been harmed don't get to have a voice in how in articulating how they were harmed or the impact of the harm on them, and most importantly, what they feel needs to happen to make it right. And in restorative justice, once we meet with all the parties, we bring everyone together with community resources to have a dialogue around what happened, the impact of the harm, because when we understand the impact of our actions, that's truly what drives behavior change. But then the person who was harmed actually gets to have a say in what they feel like they need to feel like they, that harm was restored and made as right as possible. Not to say that we can, turn back time and make sure it didn't happen in the first place, but we always ask the question, well, what needs to happen now to put things as right as possible? And then we develop a plan for that. In our school systems, sometimes that looks like, depending on the offense, sometimes that'll look like monetary reparation, or sometimes that will be even as simple as sometimes the person who was harmed just wants an apology, or sometimes it's even leveraging the strength of the person who's committed the harm. So for instance, I had a young lady once who committed a harm in her school, and one of the things that we recognized in that young woman was that she had amazing leadership potential, and that in that moment, she was not exercising her leadership potential in a positive way. So part of the plan that everyone in that meeting came up with was that they wanted to see her acting as a leader on her school campus. So it was asked of her that she would join the school's leadership club, so that she could put those leadership skills to better use. And so those are just a few examples of how that work can look, but it's also very much about making sure we're working proactively. And so in schools, that looks like, working with educators, working with school counselors, working even with school police as well to, how can we build community amongst one another, amongst students, amongst the adults, and in order to build a climate in which we're seeing each other as humans. A lot of conflict occurs out of us dehumanizing one another, and the restorative work really seeks to humanize each person that's involved. And so we work both to help schools and educators learn how to build positive relationships, so that when we have to utilize a restorative process, a restorative dialogue to address a harm that was caused, there's something to be restored back to, right? So if we're in an environment where there's no relationship and there's no sense of community, then there's nothing to be restored back to. So that's just a little bit of a background, and I'm happy to, at the end, answer any other questions, but I'll go ahead and hand it over to our next speaker.
Thank you. And that will be Trevor. And we have a tape that we will be playing of an interview with Trevor.
Leave the class or just go do stuff. But as we got to know one another, we learned how to be graceful with one another. We learned how to listen to one another. We learned how to not overtalk somebody just because we had something we wanted to say. And we learned how to really honor one another in a space like that, because it felt safe, because we were a part of building the safe environment, because we build or lay down ground rules. But that was like the first introduction when I was 15, and it just built upon that all the way up to my senior year. I was running them at helping the NCRC at different schools run community building circles, and I'd get called out of class to sometimes mediate fights. And I remember when my senior year of high school, for a sophomore class within the Law Academy program at Crawford High School, there was a big classroom fight. It wasn't just like one person, it was these 3 girls versus a whole classroom of people, and there was like sub problems going on, and they called me out of class, and I actually had to, with a friend of mine, Diana, we had to lead a community building circle for 2.5 days. It was a long period of time until we got to the root of the problem and built reconciliation with like the class over the course of almost 3 days. But it's powerful work built into spiritual principles that I think really wield justice in different ways. And so that's a little bit about the work in me.
Thank you. How do you use it now, or are you using it now?
I would say I've had a plethora of jobs working with different nonprofits or kids doing ministry related things. And I think being in leadership positions, it's easy to be a dictator or a very authoritative person, or not listen to others and say my way or the highway and not show grace. But I think this work teaches you emotional intelligence. It teaches you to listen. It teaches you to watch. It teaches you how to be still and create space for others, because you're not the only person in the room. And so it flows into other areas of life, whether you're, I think, a parent, a student, a teacher, a coworker, a boss. And so I've been able to, I have roommates, and we have disputes as roommates do. And I had to learn when I have a problem and I'm bringing forth a problem, that doesn't mean that they don't have a problem. And I need to create space for them to feel safe enough to share something with me and not have me just, bulldoze the conversation. And so I'd say the biggest aspect of this work is, when we have a talking piece, because everyone has something they want to say, but, we should listen to understand and not just listen to talk. And so, yeah.
Very nice. So what, as far as the results, when you use that example with the big classroom fight, after those days of discussing, did people change their behaviors?
Yes, we actually had, so I don't remember the problem in detail, but there was a girl that I think slept with another girl's ex, and then there was friend gossip, and then there was like people calling each other names within the class. And as I facilitated, I kind of picked up on certain stuff, and I had private conversations with some, and then I'd bring them back into class. And by the end of it, one of the girls, kind of the main girl that the problem was around, that she apologized, and we had some other people apologize, and we talked through solutions. So I've realized that I don't want to be the person always suggesting solutions, but giving people the tools and the power to create them for themselves. And I realized doing this work, it teaches you how to pull others into leadership with you, and to be critical thinkers and kind of think about solutions for themselves. So.
Very nice. Now, one of the reasons the League is looking into this is we're trying to interrupt this, what's called the school to prison pipeline. Did you see any changes as far as students getting arrested on campus or anything like that?
I honestly did. I remember I think it was my junior year of high school, we had a wild class, but it was more wild my sophomore year. And we had the same students in our class because we were in a law academy program. But I remember there was this one kid, his name was John. That's what he went by, but that was not his actual name. But we were in circle. He was always kind of being a troublemaker, occasionally getting like called out of class with security or just different stuff. And he was a funny kid, but he was very surface level. He never really talked about his life, always passed the talking piece in circles. And I remember one day, because sometimes you have to repeatedly do it to see for like, it's not going to happen like one time. For some people, it may take, 6 months. And this one time, I've been in class with him all year and I've never heard him say anything productive or like deep. And he shares about his life just randomly. And he talks about how his dad is a pimp and how growing up, he like actually hurt people. And I think he even said he killed somebody. And he
Wow.
was literally just getting super deep. And he felt safe enough to talk about his life. And not just his life, like crimes he's committed on behalf of his father. And and I think the teachers got to hear their students' stories, so they weren't quick to judge and send them out of class. And there was a incentive. Like we had this one teacher, Miss Candor, Monique Candor, and she would incentivize us for good behavior. She's like, if you're good, we're gonna have parties on Fridays. If you do this group assignment, you guys are gonna plan a field trip. Or like, so there was a lot of collaboration that made school fun while doing this work, because we would have community building circles, I think, every day my junior year. And so it was beautiful work, and I got to see people's behavior kind of change. I wouldn't say it was like drastic, but the vulnerability, the intentionality with teachers and students, and the grace that was shown was beautiful. So
Wonderful, wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this?
Yes, you don't have to be a teacher or an educator to get into this work. I think these are life skills. I think it teaches you how to be a good friend, a good mom or dad, a good child to those around you. And I mean, the more educated on the work, the better, because you get to be in a simple form, just a better human to those around you, and walk in a leadership role and help others around you. So
That's very good. I was just wondering, you started it in high school. Do you think it's appropriate in middle school or anything below, or do you think they're
yes.
not ready for it? Yes, yes.
I don't know about elementary school kids, but as I've done work, I'm a TA right now. And last semester, I went into schools with a different nonprofit. I used to think elementary schools are like elementary school kids maybe not have the cognitive awareness or like the intelligence for high level thinking. But I am so wrong, because going into schools, and I'd have like 10-year-olds like be able to hold a conversation with me really well about life, about like high level topics, about in some ways emotional intelligence. Last week I was on a playground and I was hearing this kid talk about just like a well of emotions and how to navigate that, or things you should or should not do. And I'm like, are you having this conversation in elementary? And so I think when you hold people to a higher standard, most of the time they will rise to it. But if you don't think sometimes people can do it, I think they will live at that standard. So I think it's better to raise the standard and say, hey, we want to teach you some things, and if you fall a little short, there's grace and support, versus saying, we're just not going to teach you these things because we don't think you're ready for them. But that's my opinion on it. I think it's good to teach them young and train them up in the ways.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yes. And maybe they can bring that back home too. Maybe help their parents with. Many of us never learn the lesson throughout our whole lives. So, yes.
A talking piece in the household. We're not going to overtalk each other.
All right. Well, anything else you'd like to add before we close this?
No, I shared my thoughts and my heart.
Well, thank you so much. We're so glad that you could share your perspective, because it's something that most of us don't get to see. So again, thank you very much.
It was a joy to be a part of the panel.
All right. Thank you. I thought that was wonderful for Trevor. All right. Our next speaker is Jess Nadeau. She is the Assistant Director of the Center for Restorative Justice. She has a Master of Arts in Higher Education Leadership and a certificate in Restorative Justice Facilitation and Leadership from the University of San Diego. Jess previously worked with the Office of Ethical Development and Restorative Practices at USD, where she served as a hearing officer for student misconduct, including sexual harm, alcohol offenses, health and safety violations, and more. As part of that role, she also trained students in restorative practices and advised them in their role as peer hearing board members. Jessica's research explores institutional readiness to implement restorative justice for cases of gender-based harm. In her recent study, victim advocates, conduct professionals, and university administrators at USD participated in stage match interventions, evolving through the trans-theoretical model of change with a growing motivation to lead policy change that supports RJ resolution options for gender-based misconduct. She recently wrote a chapter co-authored with David Karp in a forthcoming book, Reframing Responses to Campus Sexual Misconduct, a Restorative Justice Approach. With that, Jess, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the Center for Restorative Justice and share a little bit about what we do. The Center for Restorative Justice, where I work, is housed at the University of San Diego, but we're actually a national hub of training, consultation, and support and research. So we support higher education institutions, K through 12 schools, community organizations across the country in training and building up their own restorative justice practices and programs. And we do that for, restorative justice in education and really across the board of many different types of applications. As you heard in my bio, I'm particularly interested in restorative justice for Title IX and gender-based misconduct. So that's what I'll talk a little bit about this evening. It's important to note that when I say gender-based misconduct, I'm really talking about a whole spectrum. Sometimes our mind goes to the worst on the continuum, but there is a whole spectrum from stalking to harassment, signs, chance, encouraging rape, kind of that climate, relationship violence, and assault. And so I use that term gender-based misconduct to really be an umbrella for all types of different harm that can happen on a college campus. And I think this is an important angle to consider when we're talking about restorative justice, because it really shows that RJ is possible even in the most extreme cases of harm. And I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about my why I'm interested in this work and why I'm interested in RJ applications to gender-based misconduct. So when I was a freshman in undergrad, another student was kidnapped while sleeping on her friend's couch across the street from my dorm room. I could see the place she was kidnapped from where I slept. And 2 other students who had been recently sexually assaulted on and near campus came forward with the hope that their information could help find her. And because they came forward, they had to relive the details of their assault over and over and over again to investigators. A month later, Brianna's body was found abandoned in a field, and 11 months later, a suspect was arrested. And then finally, 2 years later, the surviving women relived the details yet again to a packed courtroom full of strangers. The defendant didn't have to say anything. This case had an impact on my college career. It happened when I was a freshman. I was very involved in the student newspaper and covered the case. I was in that courtroom. So really almost my whole college career, this was a huge part of campus life and in the news. And a decade later, I still sometimes wonder if anybody asked those surviving victims or Brianna's family what they needed to find healing. I still wonder in what ways that trial caused further hurt. And I remember the way that it changed our campus community, the way it left me and other women running to our cars after dark in fear, carrying pepper spray, jumping at every sound as we lay awake at night. And the criminal justice system didn't try to repair our trauma, fix our fear, apologize, address the cycle of violence, or even simply ask anybody what we needed to feel safe again. But restorative justice makes space for all of that. Restorative justice is a victim-centered approach that aims to understand the harm and repair it to the extent possible. It's a vastly different system to most criminal justice procedures that instead seek to determine who broke what rule and how they should be punished. Now, I'm not saying this case that I just described is right for restorative justice, but I think about it because it points to issues in the criminal justice system and why a lot of victims don't come forward. And on a college campus, the reporting system and the hearing boards that follow are modeled after the criminal justice system. So on a college campus, if somebody comes forward, these cases are referred to a hearing board if that's what the victim chooses to do, or they can do nothing. And under federal Title IX law, victims can be cross-examined. The hearing board determines whether the alleged offender is responsible for the violation. They set sanctions, which are often punitive. And it really sets up the person responsible to be in a state of denial or to be defensive rather than actually take accountability. And even if the punishment is suspension or expulsion, that's passive, right? The person responsible doesn't actually have to do anything. In fact, they have to do quite the opposite. They do nothing. And the first hearing board that I was on when I started working at USC, the student responsible cried the whole time. They were actually quite remorseful, but there wasn't a space for them to try to repair the harm. There wasn't space for the person harmed to share what they needed. So given all of this, I really wanted to find a different way. And although USD is home to the center and has a strong restorative justice foundation, at the time, they weren't using RJ for gender-based misconduct. So I started this research project that was mentioned in the beginning. And I just wanted to share one quote that I thought was really powerful. And this is from an administrator who had never been in a restorative justice circle before, but then was as part of the research process. And it really became clear that by participating in RJ, the administrators that I was working with saw a clear alignment with their personal values and the school's mission with a restorative process. Some of those values are inclusive decision-making, empathy, healing, accountability. And this is what one person said. I don't think people are learning through the current process. The focus isn't on learning or restoring or addressing the harm. It's on who wins and who loses. And I think typically everyone loses and no one wins. I think restorative justice might have the power to change that. to make it more of a focus on actually holding space for lifting the hurt and lifting the pain and getting some healing done, and actually having some lessons, deep lessons learned. And I think that's just such a beautiful illustration of how RJ can really address harm in ways that our traditional criminal justice or conduct process cannot. I think it's also important to note that on a college campus, actually really most cases of gender-based misconduct, it's not really those cases where a stranger's lurking in the bushes and it's a predator that the person harmed doesn't know. Usually there's alcohol involved. These are young people who aren't communicating. They have a relationship where an encounter goes wrong. And so typically, a lot of times we're seeing that there is a desire to do better. But when we're placing those responsible in this traditional punitive system, the option is to be defensive, right? We're not giving that pathway to address the harm, to take responsibility. So as a result of my project, the institution now is offering a restorative justice pathway for students who request it. And we're working on making the option more widely known and rooted in process and policy. So I'm really excited about that. Earlier, Jennifer did a great job of sharing the history of RJ and some details on what the process is about. So I won't repeat that, but I will underscore some particulars about cases for gender-based harm that I think are really important. And part of that is that, well, first, in the current regulations for Title IX, an informal option is required. And so it doesn't necessarily specify what that informal option is to resolve cases, but we have found that restorative justice is a good option. So it's in the regulations. This is a possibility for schools. It's also, sometimes some of the criticism will say, well, this will just cause more harm, but we know that the current process can cause more harm. It definitely does. And so this is an opportunity for us to at least try to do better. And I think it is a better option. RJ comes with highly trained facilitators. In the case of sexual misconduct, the person harmed and the person responsible can meet separately. There's often a shuttle process that happens if that face-to-face interaction is not something that they want. And I think it's particularly important that it gives that control and the voice back to the person who has been harmed. They actually get to have a say in what they want out of a process. And many victims want to be heard, acknowledged. They want information or answers about an incident. And a traditional process may not allow for that. So some potential restorative justice resolutions that can come out are counseling the person responsible, educating themselves or educating others and peers on consent, acknowledging harm, an apology. And these are resolutions that are decided on together by the person harmed and the person responsible in order to really create an agreement and way to move forward that is inclusive of the people who are actually impacted by the incident. And I want to just underscore that this is an option. Restorative justice should be voluntary. And so it's not right for every student in every case, and that's fine. But just because it, is an option doesn't mean it has to be the only option. But I think it's really important to just underscore that this gives victim survivors a choice in how they want to move forward and can encourage reporting because it does give that control and voice back. So I will take some more questions at the end, and I just want to thank you again for letting me share a little bit about this type of harm and how restorative justice can be applied. I'll drop a couple resources in the chat, so hopefully our host can send that out to the group. One is a video which includes a case study and a little bit more about how RJ for gender-based misconduct works. And then if you're interested in knowing more and staying in the loop about the center's offerings, trainings, news, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and I'll put that in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. That was wonderful. All right, and our final speaker is John Serrano. John was a police officer for 30 years. He began his career as a San Diego police officer. He was a patrol officer, beach team officer, field training officer, and later promoted to detective, where he worked with the Domestic Violence and Sex Crimes Unit. He was hired as a San Diego District Attorney investigator and worked in the Gang Prosecution Unit, Family Protection Unit, and Superior Court Unit. He was also assigned to the Witness Protection Unit and Range Instructor. In 2013, he was hired as a San Diego Unified School District School Resource Officer. He worked at Lincoln High School and Crawford High School. And while working at this, for the San Diego Unified Schools, he became involved in restorative justice. RJ offered an opportunity to hold the responsible youth accountable and gave the person harmed a voice. So with that, I will pass it on to John.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel with restorative justice. It's certainly been my passion for, gosh, I think as long as Jen and I have been doing it with the National Conflict Resolution Center. Yeah, it's been a long process with the restorative justice work that we were doing on the campuses. But yeah, when you were reading my my bio there, I was like, wow, you know, I kind of almost forgot about some of those places that I worked back in the day. And yeah, I started off right out of college as a police officer when I was 25. And I always had a vision. I wanted to really go out in the community and help people and make a difference in our criminal justice and juvenile justice system. And you have to keep in mind, we have two systems of justice. We have the adult system, of course, and the juvenile justice system, which the laws are a little different. The way we deal with juveniles is different than the way we deal with adults. The institutions are different. Even some of the sentencing laws are different as well. But anyhow, long story short, yeah, I had a long career in policing. So after I left the police department, I was able to go to the district attorney's office as an investigator. And there I learned a lot about the adult system, a little bit on the juvenile side, but not a whole lot. And after I left the district attorney's office, I had an opportunity to work with the San Diego Unified School District School Police Department. And I really wanted to try to give back to the community and really apply what I'd learned in my career on campuses. And I think, you know, I pat myself on the back. I think I was successful on my campuses that I worked. My first year as a school police officer was at Lincoln High School. And I remember my supervisor calling me one day and says, hey, would you be interested in going to Lincoln as a campus officer? And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. You know, there was, and I'll be honest, there were officers that really didn't want to work that school because it was busy. It was in Southeast. There were all kinds of things going on the campus, fights, drugs, gangs. And unfortunately, there were some officers that, you know, chose not to go there. And I said, no, you know, I'd be really interested. And I grew up in the community right down the street. Just a little quick, just snippet about myself, where I grew up. My mom and I lived together in that area. I went to school at St. Rita's, so I was really comfortable in that neighborhood. I'm Hispanic. I speak Spanish, so it really offered me a great opportunity to work with the youth in that community. Everybody hear me okay still?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure. Okay, so from when I was at Lincoln is just about the time when restorative justice was being introduced into San Diego Unified School District. I don't recall how exactly that came about, but somehow or other it was introduced. You to our school superintendents, and then it, of course, to our high schools and whatnot. I remember sitting in my office one day at Lincoln. It was a very busy day. I was the only police officer on campus, uniformed police officer on campus, and I remember sitting in my office at the end of the day. And I've shared this story before, but I sat there with literally like 10 reports that I had to complete on arrests that I had made. And keep in mind, back in those days, we didn't have restorative justice. We had some diversion programs that we could send kids to, but we didn't have this type of dynamic work that we could do with kids in the schools. And I remember calling my supervisor at the end of the day and saying, "Hey, boss, I've got all these reports. We had this going on, that going on. I can't operate like this anymore. There's got to be a solution to this. We can't just, bring a kid in, arrest him, put him in juvenile hall, or call parents. They go to court. There's no accountability. Both, parties don't ever meet. There's no, sense of remorse on behalf of the suspect or the responsible youth. They just continue to commit crimes. And then, as a police officer, when I would take them to juvenile hall, basically all they would do was call parents, come pick them up, and they'd go home. Unless it was a serious crime, then of course they'd stay in juvenile hall, or wait till go to court. And if you think about it, when you go to court, oftentimes you have a defense attorney, you have a prosecutor, but sometimes those victims, those suspects, don't meet. And with restorative work, we actually had both parties meeting, in a room, in a circle, not only with the responsible youth, but the person harmed, but other stakeholders that were affected by what happened on campus. The police officer, of course, that responded to it, the principal, the vice principal, the counselors, the two kids involved, the parents of both youth, and so it really was an impactful, and is an impactful and powerful tool that we continue to use in our communities here in San Diego. But so I was sold that very moment that I heard about it, and started going to some trainings and meeting Jen and some of the other restorative justice cadre staff that I connected with. And I think it just came down to just the type of police officer I wanted to be on my campus. I wanted to embrace the children that come to school, because they want to come to school and learn. And that was the most important thing for me, is like, you come to this school to get an education, not to fight, not to deal drugs, not to be in gangs, but they're kids. Okay. So we had to find a way to deal with that. And so I embraced restorative justice. I think it really is and continues to be a positive reform in the system of juvenile justice. And like I said, in court, these kids probably would never ever meet, and so there would be no voice, and basically both parties would just leave, and there'd be no healing, there'd be no empowerment, no stakeholders, no sense of accountability, and no way to strengthen those relationships that we have on campus. The other thing I wanted to also discuss is the juvenile record component of it. So if you think about it, back when we didn't have restorative justice, a youth is arrested. Of course, there's an arrest report. They go to court, and then of course, they're sentenced by the judge. And then there's a record. The youth has a record now on their record, and for several years, I think until they're an adult or 21 years old, depending on the crime. Say you're 16, 15, whatever years old, and that stays on your record. And think about it as like, when you go to try to find a job as a young person, and you filling out that application, it says, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Well, yes. And there automatically goes, wow, I can't even get a job now. So, I mean, that was another tool that I looked at with restorative work in that it really incentivized that kids could look at it and go, wow, this is something great. This is something I think we should participate in. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold, so sometimes my throat gets a little scratchy. But the other component I wanted to talk about too was, and I think one of it is also what this whole panel is about, not only just the restorative work that we're doing in education, but the notion that should we have police officers on campus or should we not? We've seen in the news and the media how our nation is throughout not just San Diego, but throughout the world, and how we've had violent shootings all over. And it's unfortunate that it happens like that. I don't know if we will ever remove armed police officers on campus. I know some communities, some agencies have police officers that rove, meaning that they check in to the campuses. They don't necessarily stay on the campus. I do know that for San Diego, we do have police officers on campuses, daily. But what I do feel is that those officers, who want to work those campuses should be handpicked by a community of persons, whether it be not just the local agency selecting the officer, but say perhaps having a community member, maybe even a student on the interview panel, the principal, vice principal, counselors, have a panel. So when you select those officers, you select those officers that really have a passion to work with youth, really have a history with working with youth, and embrace that restorative work that we've been doing. And I think of us as the folks that started with doing this as like trailblazers, where we've kind of paved the way, and now we need officers to take over that. And I think we're kind of getting there, but I've been retired from the schools for about 5 years now, so I'm not exactly sure what exactly is going on campuses now. I do know that the district attorney's office has embraced restorative work, the judges, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, and I think that's the number one thing they ask initially if there is an arrest of a youth, within the courts, is doing the restorative work with the youth. If the juvenile justice system has changed, even for right now. We don't call juvenile hall anymore. It is now the Youth in Transition Center. So it's been totally remodeled, revamped. Everything's changed in hopes that we can curb some of the crime that goes on with some of our youth. The other thing that I was talking to a colleague about was, if you recall back when our school, a few years ago, a lot of schools had what we call zero tolerance. And if you remember, there was a list of things that were zero tolerance, bringing a weapon to school, drugs, threatening teachers, things of that sort, that automatically suspended our youth. That was an automatic suspension. You were gone 3 days and you stayed home and did nothing. Or we found that in some studies that some of our youth, would leave home and go wander around and commit more crimes. So I believe the school district changed that, and looking at a different type of restorative discipline plan for our youth, and changing that instead of having the zero tolerance and the kids being them sent home, they would have like an in-school type suspension, so the kids would remain on campus, get the treatment they need, and remain on campus to get the education that they were there for. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We also do, I was talking about the police officers on campus, but we also have campus supervision officers on campus that I think should also be an arm of restorative work, and they have been when I was working on the campus at Crawford, because they basically are our eyes and ears on the campus. And when I was at Crawford, we had 3 or 4 campus supervision officers who were very, very well. They were, on the campus supervising the kids, but very much involved, probably even more so than me, with the youth. But I think that in the future, I think they've been through some of the restorative training, if I recall correctly, but I'm not sure. Like I said, I've been kind of away from it for a few years now. Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell with regards to that. Yeah, and like I said, I don't know what the future holds with having police officers on campus or not. I know that one thing, though, I do recall when I was in college, I was a campus supervision officer, and I remember some of the high schools I worked at, the officers were in plain clothes, so they were just a suit and tie kind of type thing versus uniform. There's been discussion about going back to that. I don't know, where we're at with that, but I think that most agencies would be amenable to not having police officers on campus, so long as they knew that that somebody's going to be handling the what would you say, the act, the criminal acts or whatever you want to call them on campus, and making sure that each campus has some sort of restorative team to address those types of incidents.
Okay, thank you, John.
Yeah,
shall we move on to our questions?
I'm hoping I covered everything.
and maybe there'll be some questions that you're kind of coming up with some questions of your own.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to start the first question. And thank you, John. Got a lot of good. I had not realized the youth in transition centers, so very good to know.
Yes.
And by the way, we would, if a crime was committed, if an actual crime, of course, police would be called to just as if the crime happens at your home, we would expect a police officer to come there. So.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to start with what schools in San Diego practice restorative justice, and how many schools have trained student mediators? I'm not sure which of you can answer that. Jennifer, Jess?
Yeah, it's I know it's a bit of a challenging question to answer, only because the way I think someone else had mentioned it, maybe just the idea that this is very much a voluntary process. And the reason is because you can't mandate someone to be restorative, right? It just doesn't make sense. And so a lot of the work that we're doing in schools has happened very organically. And we've done that through training educators, through training administrators, even working with and providing, information training to board members. But these are big systems. And so just like any system that we're trying to completely shift the way that things are operating in all avenues. So from the highest of leadership within our education system down to even the students, right? And so that's a very big system to try and shift. And so there are many schools I've had the pleasure of working with in San Diego Unified, with Vista Unified, Oceanside Unified, Escondido. And there are definitely a lot of great things happening in districts across the county. But again, it's not something that I would say as a whole district that anyone is doing it fully, because we're trying to, again, shift these very large systems, and keeping in mind that it is a little bit newer, right, to our educational system. And so sometimes from the outside, it feels like there's not a lot that is shifting. But, when you see the way that like in my work, I have the great pleasure of being able to work directly with educators and training them. And so I've been able to see the number of, and this is of course just anecdotal, but the number of educators and schools and administrators that call upon us at the county office, for instance, to provide restorative training and support and coaching over the 8-9 years that I've been doing this work. When I first started, I would say the words restorative justice, and people would say, well, I know what those two words mean in of themselves, but you put them together and I have no clue what you're talking about. And that's really shifted over time. And so to answer the question of what schools are doing restorative justice, I would say in every school or district in the county, I would feel confident saying that there are pockets of restorative work happening. But whether it is pervasive across the entire system, no, of course not. But that is kind of what we are working towards. And I know, John, I think you were kind of chiming in to add some things too. So if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yes, so Marlene submitted a question. Are there examples of restorative justice being used in school board meetings to promote a more productive civil discussion versus turning ugly and disruptive? Anyone know of examples of it being used in a school board setting?
I do not.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I know of any specific examples, but it is, like I said, I've had the pleasure of being able to train school board members and things like that, but not anything that systemically has changed the way that it's operated.
And Jess, do you want to turn your video back on, and Jeannie for the Q&A? And maybe John, if you want to try yours again, there should be a camera icon in the top left corner that you click to switch the video from front or from back to front.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you are.
Am I here?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
We can see you. Yay.
Hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can see.
Oh my God.
Well, I'll take
Okay.
the next question. Bonnie Skolnick asked, where RJ is used in the high schools, is the training mostly done during the curriculum day or is it after school or separate?
I mean, if we're referring to training for educators, a lot of times educators will have professional development times set aside as part of not just for restorative practices, but for any professional development that they're needing or scheduling throughout the year. And so a lot of times we will leverage that time. At the county office, we also, and as well as other district offices, will also hold what we call like open enrollment type trainings. So like at the county, for instance, we have regularly scheduled restorative justice training scheduled throughout the year, and that is open to anyone in any role, position that just wants to learn about how to utilize restorative practices. And so educators are able to access that as well. And then if we're talking about student trainings, I know Trevor talked a little bit about his experience being trained as a student. Most of the time we are like for his program, for instance, it was integrated into some of the classroom time that in that particular program at his high school. Sometimes we'll work with avid groups, or we've also trained students during like if they've got like a homeroom, or I'm forgetting the terminology around it, but like a homeroom period or something like that, or advisory period, sorry. We've worked with students during that time. So it's really looked individualized to a particular campus on how we access students or how we work with them. Sometimes we'll work with them outside of the school hours or through a club or something of that nature, or just working with students in an after school capacity to train them up. So it's looked really different across various campuses and school districts.
Sounds like it can be very flexible and adapt to any situation.
Absolutely.
So our next question is for Jess. We're wondering if you could speak more about how you help institutions become ready to engage in restorative justice.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think it's really important to note that this takes place over a lot of time. So for the decade before me, there were people here at USD who, were using restorative justice in lots of different types of harm. And it starts with, closing that knowledge gap. You can't advocate for or participate in something, engage in something that you don't know what it is. So training is really key. And then beyond that, it's speaking to the heart. So like making sure that those trainings are experiential, that people have the opportunity to sit in circle, to see a case study of a conference and be able to really feel the change and the difference that restorative justice can make. And let's see, the other part of the question here is how to disseminate the idea and work more. And I think that kind of goes along with the same idea of helping people, helping institutions engage, and that's that training, experiencing it. And in terms of barriers, which is the last part of the question here, what are institutional barriers? I would say that buy-in. Change is scary, right, for all of us. And institutional leaders, their job is to assess risk. And so we're a little bit behind in restorative justice in terms of research, but it's catching up to the practice. And so anytime that you can show your institutional leaders some of the research that does exist, I think that is key. And having leaders do the training too, have them sit in circle. That's really what helped me in my project here at University of San Diego was, it had been happening a lot with like middle management, other employees, but leadership who are in charge of making the policy decisions and giving the green light needed to be engaged in the work too. And that just takes a lot of time to just build that restorative culture and foundation.
Thank you. We have a question from Carolyn Shadle. Are there any churches in the area studying or advocating for restorative justice? And that's open to any of you who know.
I would say that the Catholic Mobilizing Network and the San Diego Catholic Diocese are really involved in the restorative justice movement. We partner with them at the University of San Diego as a Catholic institution quite frequently. And they're really involved in the work. But in terms of like specific churches outside of that network, I can't speak to that.
Yeah, I'd agree. That's a great example, Jess. And also I think there's in the restorative work that I've done. So when we're, for instance, providing a restorative option for a young person who's committed a crime or there's conflict, I think leveraging our religious and spiritual leaders is a great way. It's part of how one of the ways in which this work is very different than how we operate traditionally is bringing in the voice of the community, both to articulate the impact that harm has on the community as a whole, but also to support the person who committed the harm. And so our church and spiritual leaders can be a big part of that. And I've definitely seen them incorporated as community members, or what we call community members in restorative conference, for instance, both, like I said, to, articulate that when harm happens, it's not just, the victim and offender that are involved in that conflict or that altercation or incident. It has a whole, like Jess was talking about her experience as, what I would call a community member is, even if a harm doesn't happen directly to you, there's still an impact. And so community leaders can be a great source in really bringing that to light, but also being a part of the healing, both for the person who committed the harm, the person who was harmed, and then the community at large.
Okay, we have another question. Are there certain types of cases or situations that are not appropriate for restorative justice? How do you decide which are or are not? That's from Jane Andrews.
I know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I know that there's sex crimes definitely are cases where are not acceptable for restorative justice work. And Jen might know some others. I think there's certain violent crimes, serious violent type crimes, felony type crimes, that would not qualify for the restorative justice, especially as officers who respond to those types of calls on campuses where they don't have. It's kind of like a mandated type reporting type thing where they have to make an arrest. But it doesn't mean to say that at the end of the day, once that case makes it through the channels, that the judge, may may decide that that putting the responsible youth through a restorative program would work for them. So,
yeah, I think it's a little bit more convoluted of a question and an answer, because there's on one hand, are we asking the question about, are there cases within our system that will not be allowed to go through a restorative process? That's a different question than, are there any situations that just in theory would not be appropriate? So those are two separate questions. John's right in the sense of like that there are certain situations or harms that are not in our country not allowed to utilize a restorative process, both within our justice system as well as our educational system. So for instance, in California, there's like the big 5 for expulsion. So there are 5 things that a school is mandated to expel a student for. And I can't remember all of them, but like one of them would be like brandishing a weapon, things like that, sexual assault. And so by those parameters, a school is mandated to expel a student for that particular offense. But even in, so I'm speaking from like the educational standpoint, even in those situations though, I'd say that there's still an opportunity for a restorative process once the student has come back, whether that's from a suspension or an expulsion. And I've had many meetings or what we call restorative conferences when a student has returned back to the school community. And there's still an opportunity for them to face the person that they have offended or harmed, and make it as right as possible, offer some remorse and amends for that person to again articulate the harm that was caused to them, and ask for something in return, or ask for some way for them to make it right. And so there's still a restorative process that in that case it might not mean that the student is able to do that in lieu of an expulsion. But then again, now there's the other question of, is any offense in theory, can it go through a restorative process? And I would say yes, depending on the participants. Like I said, we've seen a form of restorative practice used for, following the apartheid, following the Rwandan genocide. And so those are, in my mind, some of really the most egregious types of harms that we've seen in history. And still there was a form of a restorative process that was used in those cases. It looked very different. Even those two examples were very different from one another. But I'd say as long as the participants are willing and they want that process, that harm is applicable or not applicable to, but can be a restorative process can be used following any type of a harm.
And I would just like to add briefly, if that's okay, to
Sure.
Jennifer's point, what the system allows. And I think restorative justice, as a whole, is really trying to move away from these zero tolerance or like exception, no exception policies where you have to expel, have to suspend for certain violations, because then we're not able to have these processes, which could really be beneficial to all parties involved. And so at the college level, or at least here at USD, we don't have those types of policies, and we are able to use restorative justice for all types of harm, including sexual harm and others. And I think it really does come in terms of what case is appropriate. I would say, to Jen's point, like, it just depends on the people. If the person harmed doesn't want a restorative justice case, it's not appropriate. If the person responsible is not ready to take responsibility, they don't want. Restorative justice starts from a place of acceptance. Yes, I did this. I'm ready to repair it. If the person responsible isn't there, then it's not appropriate for restorative justice.
And if I could, I just kind of want to share one anecdote too. There was a case at a high school where I mediated or ran the restorative conference, and it was two young ladies, high school students, who had gotten into a really violent altercation. We had even gotten video of it, 'cause the offense had taken place in the PE room. And so the cameras caught it. And I mean, I saw the two young ladies fighting and saw the harm, the physical harm that was caused. And we did these restorative meetings. And part of this process is the person who committed the harm, they get to reflect on and articulate, where did this behavior come from? What led me to act in this manner? And in being able to kind of go through that reflection process and articulate to the person that she harmed, they were so moved and by her story, by just the fact that she was even taking accountability, that she was taking responsibility for her actions, that in that case, it was because of the type of altercation, it was mandated to go through the expulsion process, meaning that there was a hearing. So that young lady, her mom, as well as the young lady she fought with and her mother, all showed up to this hearing, and I was there as a support person. And they were so moved by this process that they advocated, the person who was harmed and her mother advocated for that other student to remain in school, because they realized that that was not the best thing for her, and that they felt so confident in that process that they all went through together that they were not going to have any other problems moving forward. And that young lady, because of that process and because of their advocacy, was actually able to stay in school.
Wow, that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Yes, it must have been very rewarding.
Well, as we wrap up, we'd like to offer our panelists the opportunity to mention any calls to action. You have in the chat already the video that Jess shared. So hopefully you'll be able to check that out later. But John, do you have anything you want to share that people can take away if they want to get more involved in this or contribute in some way to its success?
I know when I was doing work as a consultant with NCRC, I believe they still offer a pretty good program with restorative justice. And I know that if you go to their website, Jen knows it, and it's ncrc.org, I believe. But anyway, if you want to learn more about the restorative work that's being done in San Diego County, NCRC was the lead on that. So they're usually offering, some train. I don't know if they're still doing trainings, but some information that the public can access on their website as well. One thing I did want to share real quick, I know we're running short on time. I did recall, and Jen kind of raised that with her story. And I remember there was a story at Lincoln when I was working as a school police officer. We had a report of a student on campus who had stolen the phone. We went to contact the student. He was under the influence of alcohol. one of the officers was was checking his pockets for, the phone. And at one point, the student pulled out a cigarette lighter, and the officer went to reach for it, says, "You can't have this on campus." Well, the student pulled back, and basically the fight was on, I guess, if you will. And the other officer was San Diego Police. He was working with me on the campus. I was at San Diego Unified at the time. But the positive thing that came out of that was that youth accepted the responsibility, became one of our youth mentors with NCRC when we were doing circles, our conferences. And I had an opportunity, because I was, the officers were person harmed, to meet face to face with him. And it chokes me up, because we would have never had that opportunity to meet as a police officer and, and suspect, if you will, if you want to call him that, responsible youth. But we became really good friends in working together with other youth. So that's what I'm saying is that's what we bring from doing this type of work. If we didn't have that, I don't know where this young man would have been. And his story, after hearing about it, was I think he was homeless. He's been drinking. He ended up graduating with like a 4.0, folks, from Lincoln High School. And he was pretty much failing every subject before that incident. And so that's my story. And so it was.
I love those silver linings.
Yes.
So anyhow, so we still keep in touch even to this day. And that's been several years ago.
Jennifer, is there anything you want to leave us with?
I think I started off talking about all the misinformation around restorative justice. And I think as much as we are able to kind of correct that, both for ourselves as well as for other people, can be a great service. And so, even at the county office, there are plenty, and that's sdcoe.edu, that, you can find that information very easily on our website. So there are a number of resources that provide information about what restorative justice is. We've been trying to look at and provide resources for not just how this can look within the schools, but how this can look in the home. One of the things I love about this work is that it transfers over into, I'm even in my bio, it's my work with my kids. And as I use it, and jokingly but not jokingly, I say, I have the opportunity to practice restorative justice all the time with 3 kids at home.
Me too.
And so, finding, accessing those resources. But then, I know one of the ways that a lot of the folks that I've worked with have gotten involved is through being a community member in a restorative conference. This work can be really hard to kind of it's very different than any other way that we operate in any system. And so having the chance to see it and be a part of it as a community member can both help you to understand what that process is like, but also to experience it. And that's the best way to understand this work, is to experience it. So getting in touch with an organization that is doing this work, like NCRC, for instance, is a great example. And, inquiring about, well, how do I become what we call a community member in a restorative conference, so that I can, see this work in action, but also support the youth, support the community while they are going through this process, I think are some great calls to action.
And when I know it's almost after 8 o'clock, one quick thing, there is a new nonprofit that just started up with one of our former colleagues from NCRC. It's called peaceangerlove.org. So he's working towards implementing restorative community conferencing again in our schools through his nonprofit. So you can go to that website as well. I know it's just barely starting up right now. So you can check that for more information as well.
All right, I put that link in the chat. Jeannie, do you want to finish us off here?
Sure. Yes, and the league is busy doing program planning for our league and for the state. So if you would like to help us bring about change in the juvenile justice system in our schools and throughout the community, come to the Saturday, February 25th program planning meeting, and let's all vote for having juvenile justice action as one of our top priorities for our league.
So that's February 25th at 10 o'clock
February
on Zoom.
25th, yes.
Okay, well, yes, as John said, it is after 7 o'clock, so we will wrap up at this point. But thanks very much to all of our panelists, Jess, John, Jennifer, and Trevor. And thank you, Jeannie, for putting this together, and Jane Andrews for all your work. We do have an event survey that should be popping up on your chat. If you wouldn't mind filling that out to let us know what you thought about tonight's event, we greatly appreciate it. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.